Hello, art historians. Today we're going to be doing our first set of images from ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt will be divided into 3 lessons, and today we're going to start with what we call pre-dynastic Egypt. So that's before we get into all of the important dynasties and Old Kingdom and New Kingdom and Middle Kingdom and all that stuff. Before we get into any of that, we have to talk about how Egypt came to be a major powerhouse and how we began to have dynasties in Egypt. And so we're going to start with the Palette of Narmer. So as you can tell by your 2 stars here, you have 2 images. This is called the Palette of Narmer. This is the front image, and this is the back image. And both of these are your required images for the exam. So what we want to think about when we are contemplating our looking at ancient Egypt as we think about pre-dynastic. This is before we have all of our important dynasties. And then if we think about that, then how do we get dynasties? And this artwork is actually going to explain how we ended up actually getting to dynasties in ancient Egypt. So we have to sort of take apart the title here. So Palette of Narmer. And so he's the king. He becomes the king of Egypt, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we see palette. And when we think about palette, that's the thing that that you use to put paint in when you're going to paint something. A palette is, those of you who wear eyeshadow, a palette is sort of like that container that holds the eyeshadow. And so this palette was actually done in what we call that bas relief, B-A-S, R-E-L-I-E-F, that bas relief, or that low relief. And its job, it's ceremonial, but it is also served a little bit of a non-ceremonial job, which is, this is the part that makes it the palette. This part right here, that little well, is where ancient Egyptians would have put kohl, K-H-O-L, which is that dark makeup that would have been made partly from ashes and things like that, ground together to make a dark paste. Kohl, the ancient Egyptians wore underneath their eyes because it protected their eyes from the sun. It's sort of the same reason that football players put black under their eyes, is to keep the sun from reflecting into their eyes and blinding them. So when we're looking at this, this palette tells the story of how Egypt was brought together to become a single empire. Its job, this palette, is it's commemorative, and its job is to commemorate the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into a unified Egypt. And the way that happened is King Narmer basically went to war with the other branches of Egypt, and he defeated them and united Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into a single unified dynasty underneath his power. And so we have a pretty good date, 3100 to 2920 BCE, and that's because we know the date in which Narmer conquered Egypt. And so in 3100 BCE, Narmer unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, and he and his descendants remain in control for quite some time. And what Narmer does is Narmer establishes a theocratic, T-H-E-O-C-R-A-T-I-C, theocratic political system. And whenever you think about theocracy, theology, that has to do with religion. And so a theocratic political system is one that is based around a unified religion. And so what you see here is a a work of art that is told in registers, like the standard of Ur. Here's register 1, 2, 3, register 1, 2, 3. But you have to think about when things were taking place, and you have to remember that the standard of Ur came after this. So because we have to remind ourselves that, people come to different artistic talents at different times, depending on where they're located in the world, how they trade with other people. And so what you see here is a pre-standard of Ur telling of a story in registers. We do know that the people from Egypt interacted with the people from Ur, and so it's likely that Egypt was already working art in registers by the time Ur got around to making the standard. The standard of Ur is just the much more famous version of a story told in registers. So when we think about our word iconography, and that iconography are images or symbols in a work of art that help us identify things, we see some things here in the palette of Narmer that are clearly examples of Egyptian iconography. And we're looking at things like this cow god at the top. That's Hathor. So that is a very Egyptian thing. This we call it, I call it, it's terrible, but like the bowling pin hat, that is very Egyptian iconography. The bird here, that is also incredibly Egyptian. That's Horus, the god of Egypt, the falcon. And so we see lots of these, this is papyrus. So there's lots of images here that are part of Egyptian iconography. I just yawned. I'm so sorry. It is a Monday morning and I'm very tired. So what we're looking at here are the actions that Narmer took over a course of several years to unify Upper and Lower Egypt into a single dynastic Egypt, that took place over several years. But they are displayed on this palette, this commemorative palette, as a single event. And that's just because it is meant to be commemorative. We see the very first thing that you should notice is hierarchy of scale. Look at how large Narmer is here compared to his enemies. He's even, standing on his enemies. This is his servant. Look at how large Narmer is here compared to his other servants. So that first thing is that we have that hierarchy of scale. The most important are the largest, and it's really, clearly Narmer. We see the beginning of an attempt to identify musculature. That's what those lines are on his leg and the lines in his arm. We're attempting to show the muscles and the veins in the thighs and in the arms. So we have these really interesting beginning iconographic images. So when we're looking, we're going to look at one at a time, and we're going to sort of take apart the palette of Narmer in a way to sort of explore what he was able to accomplish and the story that was attempting to be told by the people who were trying to document his accomplishments. So when we think about that, we know if anyone was trying to document his accomplishments, it must be someone who had some sort of was invested in needing to document this. So a member of his court, someone that he was that was in debt to him. We're looking at stuff like that. Now, this is the actual palette of Narmer. What I'm going to do very quickly, though, is I'm going to switch to this next slide, which is a drawing of the palette of Narmer. And it's just a little easier to see what's happening when we look at it from this view. So the first thing we notice when we're looking at the front, so we're going to look at this one, the front here, is we notice that up at the top, we see the head of Hathor, that cow goddess. And she is seen 4 times in this upper register, 1, 2, and then twice on the back, 3, 4. And the important thing is that we know that she becomes one of the important gods at the beginning of the unification. She's later replaced by Horus, and we will see that later in other works. But so we see here Hathor, and we see some symbols that are a little less obvious to us about exactly what they are. And there are questions about whether that is a person. And the reason that there's a question about whether that is a person is because these are clearly people. And when you look at them, it's a little kind of scary, but these are people that have been decapitated and their heads are buried between their feet when they're buried. This is a burial boat that was believed to bring the king or whoever into the afterlife. So these are symbols of the afterlife here. And this piece is repeated here. And it's the thought that it might be an early depiction of possibly of Osiris, but no one's really sure. So what we see here is we see what's really interesting is we get back to that composite view, his feet in front, his body turned out towards you, but his head in profile. So we're seeing him from sideways, like from the side, but these guys we're seeing from above, like a bird's eye view. And so it's an attempt to show us multiple perspectives at once, which is really interesting. You see that they're standard bearers, and here we see the examples of the standards, and you begin to see the animals that will reappear later in what we call the canopic jars in which bodies will be held. So we have our standard bearers, and we have attendants to the king, the bodies of the enemy. We see Narmer here wearing what is considered to be the cobra crown of Lower Egypt. That is what this is. It's meant to look like a cobra, and this is the cobra crown of Lower Egypt. So here we see that he's defeated the Lower Egyptians who wanted to rebel against him, and he has already gained power in Lower Egypt. What you see behind him is really, really interesting, is this is the royal foot washer who is holding his sandals. And we've talked about this in some of the other artworks that, gods don't walk on ground, and any ground that gods are on is hallowed ground. So we see these really wonderful depictions of his standard bearers, but also his sandal carrier. Now we come to this middle part, and this middle part is really cool. These are lionesses. Why do they have the long necks? Because it's an attempt to be able to show what they see Narmer having accomplished. And what that is one of the lions symbolizes Lower Egypt, and the other lion symbolizes Upper Egypt. And they are being forced by Narmer's attendants and servants to combine themselves together into a single Egypt, whether they want to or not. And so here are Narmer's servants putting Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt together in that sort of combination there. Again, we come down here, and this is the wall of one of the cities, one of the fortress cities of Lower Egypt. And here you see Narmer being symbolized as the bull, male version here with male anatomy, knocking into the city fortress of Lower Egypt and trampling over the people. So here he is symbolized as strong and powerful. There's those horns, and he's breaking into the city center, killing his enemies and uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. So that's the front. Then we'll go to the back. And I think I forgot to mention, I just actually had this thought, so I'm going to interrupt myself for a second, and I'm going to go back to the front, because I'm not sure that I said that this is really important, that this is subtractive. Clearly, we start with a chunk of graywack, which is a very, very hard gray sandstone. And we start with this piece of graywack, and then we carve away to make the image. And so I forgot to say that this is that bas relief. It is subtractive, and it is that really hard graywack sandstone, which means that this was, definitely something that was created to be very important because of the amount of time that it would have taken to create. Okay, let's get back to what we're looking at. So we're going to look on the back side here. We're going to look at the back. And on the back, we see the falcon, hawk, which is indicative of Horus, one of the main gods of Egypt. And he becomes more and more powerful as we get further and further into the old kingdom and the middle kingdom and then the new kingdom. And what you see here is a really, really interesting thing that's going on here, which is Horus is standing on top of papyrus. And papyrus is the symbol of Lower Egypt, and he's standing on top of it. So he's in charge of it. And he has got, it's kind of gross, but he's got this hook in this man's nose. And so what you see here is an embalming hook, and we see the beginnings of, the way that the Egyptians removed the brain of the person that was going to be embalmed through their nose with an embalming hook. So here you see Horus preparing the body for embalming. Here you see again Narmer's foot washer and sandal bearer. So the same little guy here has repeated himself here. And here you see Narmer wearing the sort of the crown that has sort of the symbol of the back here, and also includes the symbol of Upper Egypt. And so this becomes the sort of the symbol of the pharaohs for quite some time, as it is a combination symbol of both Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. What he has in his hand is a mace, which is a war object. It's a long stick with something metal at the end that you can hit people with. And it's incredibly, incredibly powerful and dangerous. And what he's standing in with the legs in front like this, holding onto this man's hair with this hand in the air, this is called the smiting pose. To smite someone is to kill them or hurt them. So he is in this smiting pose, S-M-I-T-I-N-G. And this is one of the soldiers that he is fighting against to bring, Upper Egypt into, the unification, Upper and Lower Egypt together. And so here you see him being smited, probably someone of high esteem in the people that he's defeating. And again, we see that again here with more dead bodies below. So again, this is seen from head on. This is seen from above in this sort of bird's eye view. What's really interesting is, we see a lot of iconography that will become really important as we move further and further into Egyptian art and history. What's really cool is around his waist here. This is the tail of a bull. Remember bull here? This is the tail of a bull that's been woven into a belt to show his strength and his power. And we show his power with the musculature and veining in his arm, the holding of the mace, the smiting pose, the fact that he is divinely chosen, because here Hathor is, I'm sorry, not Hathor. Here, I just lost my train of thought. Here we see Horus trying to, get the enemy ready for burial. And so we see all of these really powerful images that help us, put together what becomes really the common iconography for Egypt. And it starts here, right at the beginning. And so your theme is symbols and art, because all of these things are symbolic. This is symbolic of the embalming process. This is symbolic of the writing on papyrus. This is symbolic of the boats that bring us to the afterlife. This is symbolic of, joining two forces together, power and strength. And holiness. So we're looking at lots of symbols. You could also call this art told in register. This is also a narrative in art, because it's definitely telling a story. And you could even call it war art or art about battles. So lots of really cool things, going on here. Then we're going to move to this piece, which is one of my favorite in the entire world. This is at the Louvre. And this is called the Seated Scribe. It was found in Saqqara. That's how you say that, Saqqara, Egypt. And this is from what we call the Old Kingdom. So like the early Egypt. So after Narmer unites Egypt into a single unified Egypt. And so it's the early parts, so the Old Kingdom. Only the fourth dynasty, so of the dynasties that follow Narmer's unification. So what we're looking at, and we know based on who he is and what is written on his little pedestal that he's sitting on, we are able to identify who he is and what his job is and roughly who he worked for, so we can come up with a pretty good idea of what time period this was created. So this is limestone, and it's painted, and it's really quite beautiful. I'm going to show it to you the second slide, because he is carved in the round, but he's definitely meant to be seen more from the front than from the back. And so this is the seated scribe. I'm going to go back now to just the front view. It's only 21 inches high, so it's not giant. You can see that he's seated. You can see that he's painted. You can see that he's got some dark hair and some, some clearly the coloration of skin. This is funerary. It was created to mark his death, and it would have sat in his home, and it would have been believed to hold his ka, or his spirit. And so this was a funerary piece. Now, what's interesting about this funerary piece is, because he is not a king, and most of our early artwork has to do with people who are in control, or that are kings or rulers or things like that. Because this guy is not the king, we begin to see that there is a different set of rules for how we create art of people who are noble versus how we create art of people who are just sort of normal people. And those rules, it's called a canon. A canon not meaning things that you fire, but a canon, a selected group of things. And the canon of sculpture for ancient Egypt requires that kings look a certain way. And it's kind of what you're used to Egyptian sculptures looking like. I'm going to scroll forward for a minute. When we're thinking about Egyptian sculptures, we often picture them looking like this. Okay, this is what we're used to. 90-degree elbows, the standard Egyptian, walk like an Egyptian kind of guy with these very severe facial features. And then we scroll backwards and we come back and we look at our seated scribe and we think, okay, well, let's look at some of the things that stand up to us at first. And one of the first things you're going to notice, hopefully, is that he's got a little extra weight. His breasts are clearly a little fat. He's got a roll of fat here. He's got kind of a protruding tummy. And so what is really important about that is what we see is he clearly has some muscle tone there. He was muscular, but he's getting older. And so we begin to see his body changing with his age. His hair is like black and gray. But we're also seeing that he has sort of like I said, that sort of tummy. And what is that from? Well, that tummy is because he is, thick around the middle to show that he eats well. Okay. And if you eat well, and you put on a little extra weight, that shows a whole lot of stuff about a civilization. The idea that there is enough food for you not only to survive, but also to put on a few extra pounds across the middle shows that your civilization is doing well. And when we look at this, we know that part of the reason for this is that Egypt had a food surplus. There was a food surplus in Egypt because of the flooding of the Nile and the silt that it laid down and the way that it came up off the banks and put this wonderful nutrients all along the banks. They could grow everything. It caused there to be a food surplus. And with the food surplus, Egypt began to expand at an alarmingly fast rate. Not necessarily a bad thing. They had to figure out how to deal with it. But because they had this food surplus, all of these new jobs become apparent. You've got to have the people that are going to be farmers. Excuse me. You've got to have the people that are going to be tradespeople. When you have all of these crops, and you have more food than you need, you've got to go find people that need food and you've got to trade them. Here's the extra food that we have and we need this from you. And this is how Egypt imports important things like spices and stones and things like that. Now, when we have the surplus, we need the farmers, we need the tradespeople. We have to have a place to put all of the money that we make from having our food surplus. So we have bankers. We have to have rules to keep all of this money safe and to have everything go the way that it needs to go. So we need to have laws. And so we begin to have sort of like a legal system. And remember that this is a theocracy, so there's got to be priests. And of course, there's got to be the divinely chosen person who is the Pharaoh. And so with all of this, you're dealing with we begin to see a complex society. And in this rich, complex society, people can become wealthy and can become comfortable. And so what is a scribe? So the scribe, his job is to literally write down everything that the king says, that the Pharaoh says. This is a really, really important job. And so what you see here is his hand would have been holding basically like a writing instrument of some kind. And you see that he has a papyrus scroll. So it would have had some kind of ink, pen, kind of quilly, kind of reed pen kind of thing. And here's a papyrus scroll. And the job of the scribe is an important job because the Pharaoh trusts you that he is going to say this and you're going to write it down correctly. And so what we see here is this guy who is well respected. He's a very important person. He is definitely upper class and wealthy. He is definitely well fed. And he is super, super important to the king. And because he's super important to the king, he can afford these wonderful luxuries like having this sculpture made for him to hold his ka in his home before. And the belief was that your ka would inhabit something. And then after the 70 days of while your body was being prepared for embalming and all of that stuff, mummification, at the end of all of that, your ka would then go to the afterlife. But this would have held his ka until it was able to progress onto the afterlife. So this funerary statue, we see that he is human. He is more human than the kind of art that we see from the ancient Egyptians for thousands of years. I mean, when you think about that picture the sculpture I showed you before of the Pharaoh and his wife, that's, a couple of hundred years after this. It's not that they didn't have the skills to do this. Clearly they did. But that idea of this really human, very realistic depiction of people was not something that you did for royalty. So we see that he's very natural. He's very human. Because he's not a god king that is divinely chosen, he could be shown in his natural state. But we also see some really cool stuff. Look at his eyes. They're very attentive. He's definitely looking at the Pharaoh and he's definitely paying close attention. And he is, he's listening so that he can write down whatever the Pharaoh says. His ears seem to be a little bit larger than we would think would be appropriate. And that is a hint at the idea that he had to be a very good listener. He was listening all the time to what the king was saying. And his eyes are really interesting in that they are inlaid into the limestone and the eyes were made from glass. So that's why they sort of seem a little bit odd. And it is because the eyes are glass. And when we're looking at this, we really do see the contrast between this very natural, human-like person and the very much the god Pharaoh that we will see when we look at the statue of Menkaure in a few minutes. So this would have been like I said, it would have been part of the funerary statue that would have been in his house to hold his ka, and his body would probably have been buried in what is a pre-pyramidal structure called a mastaba, Mastaba. And it's kind of like if you built a very small pyramid, like big enough to hold a couple of bodies. And then instead of it coming up to a point, about a third of the way down, you just cut it off. And so it comes up and it is flat. It looks a little bit more like the White Temple and ziggurat from Tel Asmar. So, and that's what we're looking at here. His body would have been in the mastaba. This would have been in his house until his ka was able to progress on. Speaking of cause and progressing on, we're going to talk about what it looks like when we move a little further into the Old Kingdom, and we begin to look at the pyramids. And people have this idea that the pyramids, there are so many of them, and it was such a big idea and such a big deal, and blah blah blah. It happened for just a little while, for a couple of 100 years, and then they stopped building them, and they went into rock cut temples, which is like where you cut into the side of a mountain, and you cut back into the side of the mountain, and you build sort of passageways and temples into the side of the mountain. So these temples, these pyramids that many of us are familiar with and feel like we have studied 100,000 times since we were, little kids. These are the pyramids of Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu. And what you see underneath this, Mykerinos, Khephren, and Cheops, those are their Greek names, because what you have to remember is that after a while, the Greeks rule over Egypt. And so what you have here are their Egyptian names and their Greek names. So these are in Giza. And what's interesting about them, the very first thing that's sort of super interesting about them, is they're part of the Old Kingdom, because the Old Kingdom runs the 4th through the 8th dynasty. So this is at the very beginning of the Old Kingdom. But when you look at them, this is to scale. Look at the triangle here. I mean, the pyramid here, and it's a perfect square, and it's a perfect square, and it's a perfect square. And they are set perfectly on the axis. They sit perfectly the 4 cardinal directions. It's not crooked at all. It's perfectly sit on those cardinal directions. So it tells us that, much like we knew with Stonehenge, which is about this time. Stonehenge is, right around, this time. Stonehenge, we're pre-literate and we don't have any history. In Egypt, we've got, full writings, full histories, 4 languages. It's kind of a little crazy. So let's talk about some of the basics. A pyramid is a giant monument to a dead pharaoh. The interior is particularly sparse. You have 2 images. One is this drawing, and one is this photograph. Anything else that I show you here is not an official image that you're required to know for the exam or for my class. So you do have to know this drawing though. So that's why I'm going to stay on this page for a little while. So what you're looking at is a minimal interior, because this is where the deceased goes. And there are, however, what you see with these are chambers. This is the entranceway, and then there are paths, and then there's an interior chamber where the body would go. I am going to go forward just a second and show you this image, because what you end up with there are air shafts here that are left open so that the ka can escape when it is ready to move on. You usually have an entrance that comes in from the side, and then you go up a passageway, and then they usually give you a fake you out chamber, which makes you think that this is where the body is buried. And there usually is a body buried there. It's just not the pharaoh. But if you go back out and you keep going up through this passageway, then you get into another passageway, and then you finally get into the king's chamber. Okay. There's also a descending passageway that leads you into a chamber that makes you also think that you might be in the right place, but you're really not. And so that's what it looks like from if you were to take a cross section of it. And this is from the air. This is the city of Cairo that literally comes practically up to the front door of the pyramids. And when you look at it, this is where the pyramids are. And this is where the Nile River is now. The Nile River was not always this far away. The Nile River has been rerouted a couple of times. And what's important is that you know that at the time that this was created, that this complex was created, the Nile came right up to in front of the pyramids and the Sphinx. And this is indicative of the Nile and its crops, and it would come up and it would flood, and this is where the planting was. And this was called a causeway. This was the place where you would be met. There's the pyramid and then a mortuary temple. That's what this is called. It's called the mortuary temple down here at the end. And so what you see is like this complex would have been on the water, and it would have looked kind of like this. There would have been a causeway out to the water. It would have been covered in highly, highly polished limestone, so that if you were standing out in the desert and you were looking at the pyramids, they would have actually been pretty blinding because they were so white and so shiny. So here we go, back to this. So we're looking at these guys, and they would have had an interior chamber and some galleries, and they would have been filled with grave goods, things that the pharaoh could take with him into the afterlife. And many of them had smaller pyramids out here for family members and important people. This is more burial out here, more burial in the front. We'll talk about all that in a minute. So the grave goods were believed to travel with the pharaoh into the afterlife. And so what we're thinking is Horus, that hawk bird that we saw, is the son of Osiris. And when the dead pharaoh, when the pharaoh is dead, the job is that, he's got to make sure that his kingdom is, still going on, and he wants to be able to look after everything. So he has this great complex that is built so that he can take all of these things with him into the afterlife and continue to help his kingdom even after he is dead. And so these pieces were created, it didn't take them horribly long to build them, because the question is, slave labor, volunteer labor, national project. And it is less and less believed as time goes on that these were slaves. It is more believed that they were, it was like a national building project, and that they would bring people in from all over the Egyptian empire to help come and build them. The process of exactly how it was built is completely unclear to archaeologists. They're not really sure. And the reason they're not sure is because the blocks just in one of them, let's pick Khufu's. Khufu's temple is actually the largest. So if we picked, and it was the first one built, Khufu's was built first, and then Khafre's, which is a little bit smaller, and then Menkare's, which is significantly smaller, and then they stopped building them really. So Khufu's is the largest, 480 feet tall. Let me go to the next slide. I think I have all the numbers. There we go. So Khufu's is the largest, 480 feet tall. And then Khafre's is 450 feet tall. And then like half, Menkare's is only 213 feet. They were the largest structures in the world until the Eiffel Tower was built. So it's not until the mid 1800s that anything comes close to being as tall as they are. Khafre is the one in the middle, and Khafre is the one that has the Sphinx in front of it. And you know that it's Khafre because Khafre has the cap left on top. And so you can see sort of the rough edges of the limestone, and then you can begin to see a little bit of the outside facing, but none of it's as shiny and wonderful as it would have really been. So when we're looking at them, we have to think about several things. We're not sure how they built them. We know that they brought these giant blocks. Just Khufu's has about 2.3 million blocks in it, they think. Some of them were as many as 50 tons. And they've been brought a long way. And so when we're looking at the idea of how far that they had to be moved and how extensive the construction would have been, there are a lot of questions. Did they build a ramp out of dirt or out of the chips from the finishing off of the stones that came sort of in a spiral along the outside of the pyramids as they built? That's one of the things, that they would have started with like a ramp and it would have gone around and then around and then around, going up higher and higher. And then when they were done, they would take apart the ramp and use it to build the next one, and then use it. So that's one of the questions, is whether there were ramps. Another one of the questions is, what are they filled with? And the answer is not. They feel pretty dense, and there's a question about whether it's possible that some of the cut pieces from what's called dressing or finishing the stone might actually be stored inside the pyramid to use it as a way to get rid of all of that. There are a lot of questions about what the small pyramids were for, and what these vast cemeteries were for, and what the rest of this burial complex and temples were for. We know probably people of importance. We know other families of the rulers and things like that. We know that the temples, the pyramids also had the mortuary temple down by the Nile, and that the body would be brought up the Nile and then up the mortuary temple, and then it would have entered, and then it would have been sealed off. And there are questions about who would have known about these things and who would not have known about where the entrances were. And there were lots of questions about that. And we don't have a lot of answers because they were very, very quiet about how they did all of these things. We do know that there was a 70-day long process for mummification to preserve the body and the ka and to prepare it for the afterlife. We do know that there are boat pits. There are boats that are out here in some of this burial, some of these longer pieces that were the boats. The longest one that they have found so far, because of the way that the water and the silt and everything interacts, they have found like basically petrified wood parts of the boat pits. And the longest boat seems to be 143 feet long. And again, that idea of the boat helping to transport the pharaoh's ka into the afterlife. These are some ideas that begin to be more and more solidified as we go on. As you'll notice, the entrance where the body would actually come in is always facing the north. That's always facing north, all of them. And they always have access like air shafts to allow the ka of the pharaoh to escape. What's interesting about some of this is that it's clear that this was a huge building campaign, and it's clear that they created lots of really amazing things. But we're, other than knowing that this was where the body would have been greeted, and there would have been an annual sort of prayer to the dead pharaoh, and they would have enacted that prayer along the water here, and the body would have gone in and around and then through the entrance somewhere here to the north. There's a lot of questions about what its purpose is. We're also going to talk about the Sphinx, which is out in front of the middle one, the tomb of Khafre, and they believe that this is what the Sphinx would have looked like at the time that it was constructed. It would have been built what is called in situ, IN space situ, which means in the place where it is, from a single block of stone. So it would have been subtractive. And while they carved it, it basically created like a pit for it. And it would have had this beard here that would have attached to another statue of Khafre that was located between the front two paws of the Sphinx. And it would have been brightly, brightly painted to stand out against the desert. Remember, these would have been bright white, and then you would have had sort of the light yellow sand, and then this would have been brightly, brightly painted. And so what we're looking at is a combination of a human head and the body of a lion. And so why that is that, and I'm sure you've heard this, that cats are considered sacred, sacred animals or royal animals. And the reason that they believe that many cultures have cats as sacred animals is because cats would have protected the ancient granary, or the place where you stored your grain, from mice and rats. And so you would have these, mice and rats that would get into your grain and spoil it. And so you would have these cats that would keep the mice and rats out of the grain. And so because they saved the grain and thus saved you, because now you have a grain surplus, cats were highly revered. And so that is why you get the sort of the head of the human with the body of a cat, because cats are sacred animals, and the body of a lion, because what's a better cat than a lion? And so what you see is the entrance to the entrance to Khafre's temple. Here's Khafre's, and here is, the Sphinx. This is how he looked when he was first found. When they discovered him, the majority of his face had been, his nose had been knocked off, his beard had been knocked off. They believed that the nose and the beard were badly damaged during the Crusades. When they did an excavation of the dirt in front of the Sphinx, they were able to find pieces of the beard and pieces of other broken off pieces. So what they believe is that they built this Sphinx out in front of, let's go back this way, in front of the here we go. Here's the Sphinx out here to protect the temple of Khafre. And so it's just another layer of keeping the pharaohs safe in the afterlife, because if you keep them safe in the afterlife, then they're working in the afterlife to take care of you in the present life. And so that is the pyramids and the Sphinx, commemoration of a ruler, burial practices, necropolis, city of the dead, any of those. And that is where we're going to end for today. And we will do 3 more works of art when we meet again next time. Have a great day, and I'll see you later.